In 2011, a voice recording of a teenager named Alvin being stopped and frisked by two New York police officers spread across the internet. The recording depicted the officers using verbal harassment and excessive violence against the teen, calling him a mutt, threatening to break his arms and punch his face. Unfortunately, incidents like Alvin's are not rare. This raises the question of whether or not stop and frisk is the best policing method. Numerous critics, experts, and politicians pointed out that stop and frisk allows for racial profiling, creates more tension between the police force and communities, and proves to be ineffective as a crime-fighting tactic. The implementation of this practice is unethical and unnecessary. Now, for those who don't know, stop and frisk is the practice used by police officers when suspicious behaviors are detected, allowing the officer to perform a pat-down on an individual in search of illegal items, such as drugs or illegal weapons. The implementation of stop and frisk sparked controversy, as many of the stops seem to target certain groups of minority, specifically those who are Black or Latino, and presented itself as a form of racial profiling. A study done by the Vera Institute of Justice in New York City found that in every single year in the last decade, approximately 50% of those who were stopped were Black, and 30% were Latino. Because of this, stop and frisk remains incredibly unpopular among minorities who feel like they're being stopped and persecuted solely because of their race and ethnicity. Growing tensions between these communities and the police led to the Black Lives Matter movement and numerous protests across the country. A study done in New York City found that not only does stop and frisk negatively affect the relationship between the police force and communities, it also becomes ineffective, as residents in those communities are less willing to cooperate with the police because of their mistrust of police officers. Additionally, many studies have shown that stop and frisk is not the best way to prevent crimes. In New York City, 88% of the 4.4 million stops in 2013 resulted in no further actions, meaning a vast majority of those who were stopped were doing nothing wrong. Yet, with such jarring results, many people still believe that stop and frisk needs to be implemented to ensure the safety of a community. Now, for those who are in support of stop and frisk, they use statistics in New York City showing a decrease in crimes when it was implemented to defend its effectiveness. Broken windows is a metaphor describing a philosophy of policing used by former New York City mayors Giuliani and Bloomberg. The idea is that if small crimes are allowed to go unpunished, it will lead to a more lawless and dangerous society. The theory therefore encourages stop and frisk to strike down on small crimes in order to reduce more violent crimes. However, it is shown that police departments use the number of stops to measure how effective policemen are at their job. Therefore, police officers attempt to drive up the numbers of stops to secure their opportunity for promotions. Also, crime rates in New York City could have decreased for a number of different reasons, and not necessarily due to stop and frisk. Now, from a moral perspective, it is evident that there is no defense for stop and frisk. In 2014, Pope Francis spoke out against systems that reinforce racial divides, saying, "We must change it. We must put human dignity again at the center, and on that pillar, build the society that we need. It must be done with courage, but also with intelligence, with tenacity, but without fanaticism, with passion, but without violence." Instead of implementing stop and frisk nationwide, the United States should focus on improving the relationship between the police force and communities by approaching better policing tactics. Focused deterrence is the practice of targeting only people who are responsible for most of the violent crimes in an area, When used in High Point, North Carolina, not only did it cut crime numbers down by half, it also mended the relationship between the police and the community. Police officers wearing mandatory body cameras and improvement in police training are some steps proposed by Judge Scheinlin in her ruling to strike down stop and frisk in New York City. Evidently, the United States federal courts have the responsibility to recognize and prevent racial profiling and the unfair treatment of minorities under the law. In conclusion, the nationwide implementation of stop and frisk is ineffective in reducing crimes and also creates more racial divides. Teenagers like Alvin, who are unfairly stopped, will continue to have distrust in police if the people who are supposed to protect them are persecuting them solely because of the color of their skin. Actor and writer Benga Akinabe delivered a speech about the dangerous consequences of stop and frisk that ended with a thoughtful notion. This was how it was going to change. When people decide that it is no longer socially acceptable to treat people in such a manner. When people decide to get together and say enough is enough. That is when changes happen. That is how change is happening now. Thank you.